June 6, 1944. Early morning. The first American assault waves are pinned down on Omaha Beach. Casualties are mounting faster than commanders can count them. The invasion is balanced on a margin so narrow that a single coordinated German counterattack could still erase it. 150 miles to the northeast, nothing happens. In the Pas-de-Calais sector, Germany's 15th Army remains stationary. 18 divisions. More than 200,000 men. Armored formations intact. Panzer reserves fueled, serviced, and waiting. Guns are zeroed on empty water. Orders are issued, repeated, and confirmed. Hold position. These forces are not isolated. They are not confused. They are not unaware of Normandy. German headquarters has received reports since dawn confirming a major Allied landing. Signals traffic is heavy. Aerial reconnaissance shows beaches under assault. Requests for armored reinforcement from Normandy are already moving up the chain of command. The response is delay. In Berlin and at headquarters in the West, the same question keeps resurfacing. It overrides casualty reports. It overrides battlefield urgency. It overrides professional instinct. Where is George S. Patton? The answer is consistent. Patton has not moved. He is still in southeastern England. He is still visible, still photographed, still associated with an army massed opposite Calais. That assessment carries more weight than the gunfire in Normandy. For weeks, German planners have operated under a fixed assumption. The decisive Allied blow will be delivered by the commander they consider most dangerous. They believe that when the real invasion comes, it will come with Patton at its head. Anything else must be preliminary. Anything else must be designed to draw their reserves away from the true objective. So the 15th Army waits. Hour after hour, the channel remains quiet. No transports appear off Calais. No airborne drops are reported inland. The expected signal never arrives. Normandy burns, but the armored fist that could have crushed it remains motionless, immobilized by a conviction that has already outlived reality. This is not a battlefield failure. It is a decision failure. One made in rooms far from the surf, governed by reputation, fear, and certainty placed in the wrong place at the wrong time. And its consequences are already irreversible. At the moment the German command chose to wait, the military situation was unusually clear. The Allied landings in Normandy were not yet a breakthrough. They were a lodgment. The beachheads were shallow, fragmented, and dependent on weather, tides, and temporary harbors. The ports that made sustained operations possible had not been taken. The Allied armies were crowded into a narrow coastal strip with limited maneuver room and fragile supply lines. From a purely operational standpoint, this was the window. German doctrine was explicit about such moments. Amphibious forces were most vulnerable before they could deploy armor, artillery, and logistics ashore. A rapid, concentrated counterattack, delivered within the first 48 hours, offered the highest probability of forcing an evacuation. Delay shifted the balance irreversibly toward the attacker. The Germans possessed the tools to attempt it. In northern France, armored formations existed in strength. The 15th Army alone held multiple infantry and panzer divisions that were not yet committed. These formations were not shattered remnants. They were intact, rested, and positioned on interior lines. Rail and road networks from Calais to Normandy remained largely usable in early June. Movement was possible, even under Allied air pressure, if ordered decisively and early. The geography favored speed over finesse. Normandy's hedgerows, villages, and narrow roads were obstacles for attackers expanding outward, not for defenders striking inward along known routes. German units did not need to achieve a sweeping encirclement. They needed to compress the beachheads, sever causeways, and force Allied forces into a defensive posture before they could consolidate. Time mattered more than perfection. Even a partial success would have altered the campaign. A delayed breakout, higher losses, or the destruction of one beachhead would have forced Allied commanders to reconsider their operational tempo. Political confidence depended on momentum. A visible failure would have echoed far beyond the battlefield. German commanders on the ground understood this. Requests for armored movement toward Normandy were not speculative. They were grounded in established operational logic. Reports emphasized that Allied forces were still vulnerable, that command cohesion on the beaches was incomplete, and that American units in particular were taking heavy losses. The opportunity did not require strategic brilliance. It required acceptance of risk. That acceptance never came. The German High Command treated Normandy as a tactical problem subordinate to a strategic expectation. Their attention was fixed not on what the Allies were doing, but on what they believed the Allies had not yet done. The absence of movement opposite Calais was interpreted not as irrelevance, but as confirmation that the decisive blow was still pending. As hours turned into days, the opportunity narrowed. Allied engineers stabilized exits. Artillery was landed. Air superiority intensified. The beachheads merged. What had been a fragile foothold became a continuous front. By the time German leadership reconsidered its assumptions, the conditions that made a decisive counterattack possible no longer existed. The opportunity had been real. It had been measurable, and it had expired without being used. The warning did not come from German intelligence. It came from the man they feared most. In the spring of 1944, George S. Patton understood precisely how the enemy was reading the situation. He had spent years studying German operational thinking, not as theory, but as habit. He knew how German staffs evaluated opponents. He knew they ranked commanders, not just armies. And he knew that in their calculus, his name carried disproportionate weight. Patton did not need to be told that he was being watched. The evidence was constant. German signals intelligence tracked his movements obsessively. Any report placing him near the channel was treated as high priority. Any rumor of his reassignment was scrutinized, cross-checked, and elevated. This fixation was not accidental. It was the product of earlier campaigns in which his formations moved faster, struck deeper, and disrupted German planning cycles before defenses could stabilize. Patton recognized that this reputation had become a weapon independent of his actual command. After the Sicily incidents, he was formally sidelined. His authority was curtailed. His role was undefined. From a career perspective, it was a demotion. From an operational perspective, it was something else entirely. Patton grasped that his visibility, not his orders, was now the critical factor. He adjusted accordingly. Patton did not protest his assignment to southeastern England. He did not challenge the absence of real units under his control. He did not attempt to insert himself into Normandy planning. Instead, he prepared for a different kind of operation, one that required discipline of a different sort. He stayed visible. He appeared at inspections. He gave speeches. He attended public events. He allowed himself to be photographed repeatedly in areas opposite Pas-de-Calais. He maintained a routine that suggested preparation, not idleness. His headquarters generated paperwork, movement schedules, and command signals consistent with an army group preparing for a major offensive. Nothing about his posture suggested punishment or inactivity. Behind the scenes, Patton was methodical. He coordinated closely with those managing the deception effort. He adhered strictly to operational security. He avoided any behavior that might suggest he was irrelevant. He understood that a single misstep, a careless remark, or an unexplained absence could fracture the illusion. This was not passive participation. It required restraint. Patton's natural inclination was action. He believed in momentum, pressure, and exploitation. Here, he was required to do none of those things. His task was to embody potential rather than execute it, to represent an attack that did not exist, and to do so convincingly for as long as necessary. He also understood the risk. If the Germans dismissed the deception, his role would be exposed as empty theater. If they identified Normandy as the true invasion and shifted decisively, the consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. Patton's presence in England would then be irrelevant, and his enforced inactivity would become a historical footnote rather than a decisive factor. He prepared for that possibility by doing nothing to accelerate German realization. No sudden movements. No public complaints. No visible frustration. He presented patience as confidence. This was the warning embedded in his behavior. Not a message sent outward, but one directed inward at Allied command. German decision-making was being shaped by perception more than evidence. They were acting on expectation, not confirmation. That condition could be exploited, but only if the illusion was maintained without interruption. Patton did not design the deception. He did not control its machinery. But he understood its logic earlier than most, and he accepted the personal cost of sustaining it. The warning was implicit. If his image collapsed, the window would close. If it held, the enemy would continue waiting for an army that would never come. Everything that followed depended on that balance holding just long enough. The overrule did not come as a single order. It emerged through a system designed to prevent initiative. By dawn on June 6th, reports from Normandy were already alarming. Coastal defenses were breached. Airborne landings had disrupted communications. German commanders closest to the front recognized the scale of the operation faster than Berlin did. Their response followed established doctrine. If the enemy was ashore in strength, armor had to move immediately before air power and logistics hardened the beachheads. Requests began moving upward. At headquarters in the West, senior officers pressed for authority to release armored reserves. They did not need unanimity. They needed speed. The geography was unforgiving. Every hour of delay reduced the chances of a decisive counterstroke. Several formations were already warming engines when the chain of command tightened. The first constraint was structural. Germany's armored reserves were split between competing authorities. Some answered to local commanders. Others were held under direct control of Adolf Hitler himself. This arrangement was intended to prevent reckless use of elite units. In practice, it paralyzed response. The second constraint was psychological. German leadership had spent months reinforcing a single expectation, that the decisive invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais. This was not an assumption made casually. It was supported by intercepted signals, visible troop concentrations, and a steady flow of corroborated intelligence. The presence of George S. Patton opposite Calais carried disproportionate weight. His reputation acted as confirmation bias made flesh. When reports from Normandy arrived, they were filtered through that expectation. The landings were interpreted not as the main effort, but as a diversion designed to pull German armor away from the true objective. This interpretation did not require belief in Allied brilliance. It required belief in Allied orthodoxy. The Germans assumed their enemy would behave as they themselves would. The best commander would lead the decisive blow. That assumption shaped every subsequent decision. Senior commanders argued for flexibility. They did not deny the possibility that Normandy could be the main invasion. They argued that the risk of being wrong was acceptable compared to the certainty of losing the initiative. These arguments reached Berlin, stripped of urgency by repetition and delay. The decisive moment came hours later. Hitler was briefed after waking. He did not review a complete operational picture. He focused on one question. Where was Patton? The answer had not changed. Patton remained in England. The formations opposite Calais remained intact. There were no reports of movement, no airborne drops, no naval concentrations shifting north. To Hitler, this was decisive. He concluded that committing the 15th Army would be premature. If the armor moved and the real invasion followed at Calais, Germany would have forfeited its last strategic reserve. The logic was internally consistent. It was also fatal. Orders were issued to hold position. Panzer units already en route toward Normandy were instructed to halt or return. Commanders were reminded that no large-scale armored movement was authorized without explicit approval. The emphasis was not on defeating the landing force, but on preserving the ability to respond to a hypothetical second blow. This was the overrule in practice. It was not delivered with shouting or drama. It was delivered through procedure, through repeated demands for confirmation, through insistence on certainty that could not exist in real time, through a hierarchy that punished initiative more reliably than hesitation. Field commanders adapted as best they could. They redeployed infantry. They launched local counterattacks. They requested air support that no longer existed. What they could not do was concentrate armor in time to matter. As the day progressed, evidence accumulated. The scale of the Allied commitment grew unmistakable. Beaches did not collapse. Supplies continued to land. Air superiority intensified. Still, the central assumption held. The absence of Patton was treated as proof that the decisive moment had not yet arrived. By the time that assumption was challenged, the window had closed. The overrule was not a single mistake. It was a system functioning exactly as designed under the wrong premises. Authority centralized. Initiative discouraged. Decisions delayed until certainty replaced judgment. Normandy did not succeed because German commanders were blind. It succeeded because they were constrained. They saw the danger, but they could not act on it without dismantling the logic that governed their entire defensive plan. By choosing to wait for an army that did not exist, the German command immobilized the forces that could have changed the outcome. And by the time that realization surfaced, the consequences were no longer reversible. What followed was not a single disaster, but a sequence of irreversible losses accumulating in slow motion. On the ground in Normandy, the absence of a coordinated armored counterattack altered the character of the fighting within days. Allied forces that should have been compressed into the sea instead gained time. Time to reorganize shattered assault units. Time to clear exits from the beaches. Time to land artillery, armor, and engineers in quantities that transformed vulnerability into endurance. The cost was paid immediately by German formations already engaged. Infantry units thrown piecemeal into the line faced an enemy that controlled the air and steadily increased its firepower. Local counterattacks were launched without armor or with armor committed too late and too narrowly to matter. These efforts consumed experienced units without altering the strategic balance. Losses mounted, and replacements were insufficient. Every day that passed without the release of the 15th Army compounded the imbalance. Allied engineers completed work on artificial harbors. Supply tonnage increased despite weather and German interdiction attempts. Fuel, ammunition, and vehicles began arriving at rates that eliminated the logistical fragility that had defined the first hours of the invasion. The beachheads, once isolated and tentative, merged into a continuous front. German commanders in Normandy understood what this meant. Their reports became increasingly urgent. Requests for armored reinforcement became explicit warnings. They described a narrowing window, not in abstract terms, but in concrete measurements of frontage, tonnage, and attrition. These messages reached higher headquarters stripped of immediacy by the same filters that had delayed action on D-Day itself. The 15th Army remained fixed in place. Its divisions did not remain idle in the sense of inactivity. They trained. They rehearsed. They maintained equipment. They prepared for an invasion that never came. Their presence continued to shape German planning long after evidence should have invalidated the assumption they were guarding against. This was the central irony of the decision. By waiting for the decisive blow, German leadership ensured that when a decisive blow did arrive later, it would be unstoppable. As June turned into July, the operational picture shifted decisively. Allied forces achieved local breakthroughs. German defensive lines thinned as units were destroyed or worn down faster than they could be rebuilt. Attempts to transfer divisions from Patton to Calais were debated, delayed, and executed too late to restore balance. When armored formations finally began moving south in strength, they entered a battle space that no longer resembled the one they could have exploited in early June. Allied air power dominated movement by day. Roads were cratered. Fuel shortages worsened. Units arrived fragmented and were committed immediately to defensive fighting rather than offensive maneuver. The consequences cascaded. German command cohesion eroded as headquarters were overrun or forced to relocate. Communication lines were disrupted repeatedly. Decisions that required days were rendered irrelevant by events unfolding in hours. What had been a calculated delay became an uncontrolled retreat. The deception that had immobilized German reserves now achieved its final effect. At the end of July, Allied forces launched their breakout. By then, the German front in Normandy was already brittle. The armored formations that might have countered such an operation had been squandered in delayed commitments or were still recovering from transit and attrition. When the breakout occurred, it did not meet a coherent defense. It met exhaustion. This was the moment when the waiting ended. On August 1st, 1944, George S. Patton entered the campaign not as an illusion, but as a commander with real forces. The army that had existed only on German maps materialized where it was least expected. Not at Calais, not across the narrowest point of the channel, but through the space opened by weeks of delayed German response. The advance that followed was not miraculous. It was enabled. German units encountered during this phase were often incapable of coordinated resistance. Many lacked fuel. Many lacked heavy weapons. Commanders reported being unable to assemble reserves because none existed within operational reach. The earlier decision to preserve strength for a second invasion had left the actual front hollow. As Allied formations accelerated, the cost of the original delay became fully visible. Entire German units disintegrated under pressure. Supply dumps were abandoned. Equipment was destroyed to prevent capture. The retreat became a rout not because German soldiers lacked resolve, but because the structural conditions for organized defense had been dismantled weeks earlier. The 15th Army, when finally redeployed, could not restore coherence. Its movement came after the strategic framework it was meant to defend had already collapsed. It entered a campaign defined by pursuit rather than positional defense. The consequence extended beyond Normandy. The failure to contain the invasion ensured that the war in the West would be decided not by negotiation or stalemate, but by relentless advance into Germany itself. The destruction of German field armies in France was not an isolated event. It shaped the remainder of the conflict. It shortened timelines. It altered post-war realities. All of this traced back to a single withheld action. The waiting imposed at Calais did not merely preserve forces. It consumed them indirectly by allowing the enemy to dictate the tempo of every subsequent engagement. German losses mounted not in one decisive battle, but in a sustained sequence of engagements they could no longer control. The battlefield recorded the outcome, but it did not determine it. By choosing caution over commitment at the moment when commitment was required, the German command ensured that every later decision would be reactive. The initiative passed permanently to the Allies. From that point forward, German strategy consisted of managing decline rather than shaping events. The consequence of waiting for a ghost was not just missed opportunity. It was strategic collapse by delay. And when the waiting finally ended, there was nothing left to save. After the war, the record hardened. German officers who survived Normandy were questioned systematically. Their answers were not speculative. They were administrative. They described what they believed at the time, what they reported upward, and what they were forbidden to do. Across interrogations, memoirs, and staff studies, the same pattern appeared with minimal variation. They had expected a second invasion. Senior German commanders confirmed that Pas-de-Calais remained classified as the primary Allied objective well into July 1944. Normandy was assessed as serious, but incomplete. The presence of a large American formation in southeastern England, associated with George S. Patton, outweighed battlefield reports showing escalating Allied strength in Normandy. This was not denial. It was hierarchy. Intelligence assessments aligned with pre-existing strategic assumptions were given priority over frontline urgency. Post-war analysis by German staff officers repeatedly identified one factor as decisive: the fixation on Patton as the inevitable spearhead of any decisive Allied offensive. This fixation was not emotional. It was institutional. German planners ranked enemy commanders by perceived threat. Patton consistently occupied the top position. His previous campaigns were cited not for heroism, but for speed and operational disruption. He was considered uniquely capable of exploiting a breakthrough before defenses could reform. That reputation distorted threat assessment. Documents recovered after the war revealed that German intelligence agencies continued to rate the Phantom 1st U.S. Army Group as a viable threat even after Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. Reports noted the absence of movement, but interpreted it as preparation rather than irrelevance. The assumption persisted until the operational reality made it untenable. By then, the cost was measurable. German after-action reviews acknowledged that armored reserves held in the north could not be redeployed in time to influence the Normandy campaign once Allied air power and logistics reached full strength. The delay was no longer a tactical error. It had become structural. Units arrived depleted by movement, immediately committed to defensive fighting, and destroyed without achieving operational effect. Allied records corroborated this assessment. Declassified deception planning documents demonstrated that the Fortitude operation had succeeded beyond its initial objectives. It did not merely delay German response on D-Day. It shaped German force disposition for nearly 2 months. The illusion held longer than planners had expected, largely because German command culture reinforced it internally. Patton's role appears in these records without embellishment. He was not the architect of the deception. He did not control intelligence channels. His contribution was his presence and his compliance. Allied planners later noted that his willingness to remain sidelined, visible, and inactive was essential. A different personality might have disrupted the illusion through impatience or protest. Patton did neither. In his own post-war writings, Patton treated this period with restraint. He acknowledged the frustration, but he did not claim credit for saving the invasion. His focus remained on later operations where command and movement aligned with his instincts. That silence itself reinforced the conclusion that his earlier role had been deliberately limited. German historians writing after the war were less reserved. They identified the Normandy deception as a case study in how expectation can outweigh evidence. Several noted that the German command structure was predisposed to such outcomes. Centralized authority, fear of acting without approval, and reverence for perceived enemy capability combined to paralyze decision-making at the decisive moment. The waiting at Calais became a reference point in post-war German military education, not as a lesson in deception tactics, but as an example of how reputational threat can override real-time assessment. The record leaves little ambiguity. Normandy succeeded not because German commanders failed to understand the danger, but because they understood a different danger more deeply and could not abandon that belief in time. Patton's Ghost Army did not defeat German forces directly. It displaced them. It held them in reserve until the conditions that justified their existence disappeared. By the time the illusion collapsed, the war in the West had already passed the point where German choices could alter its direction. The documents do not argue this point. They confirm it. The case is closed. The decision that mattered was not made on the beaches of Normandy. It was made in German command rooms where certainty replaced judgment. Faced with incomplete information, the German system chose preservation over action. It chose to guard against a feared possibility rather than confront a visible reality. That possibility carried a name. George S. Patton never crossed the Channel on June 6. He did not issue a single combat order in Normandy during the invasion's critical hours. Yet his reputation exerted more force than divisions that never moved. German commanders did not wait because they were ignorant. They waited because they believed they understood the enemy too well to be fooled. They were wrong. The deception worked because it aligned with German expectations. It confirmed what they already believed about how wars were decided and who decided them. The Allied deception did not invent fear. It focused it. It gave German leadership a reason to delay action they already hesitated to take. The result was decisive without being dramatic. 18 divisions were held out of the fight at the moment when mass and speed mattered most. The invasion survived its most vulnerable phase. Logistics replaced improvisation. Air power replaced uncertainty. What could have been contained became irreversible. When Patton finally entered the campaign, the conditions his opponents had feared were no longer hypothetical. By then, German reserves were spent indirectly by weeks of inaction. The advance that followed was not the cause of German collapse in the West. It was the consequence of a collapse already set in motion. This was not a triumph of rubber tanks or false radio traffic. It was a triumph of institutional inertia exploited with precision. A system built to avoid catastrophic risk chose a different catastrophe instead. Normandy did not succeed because German soldiers failed. It succeeded because German decision-making froze at the decisive moment. No counterattack came. No second invasion followed. The waiting ended too late. If this investigation clarified the hidden mechanics behind familiar events, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. More closed files remain to be examined.